The soil of Georgia in 1857 was not merely earth. It was memory. It was blood. It was a compressed weight of generations, each layer holding within it the silent testimony of lives lived under a sun that showed no mercy and a system that offered even less. In the long, sweltering days of late August, when the cotton fields stretched outward like a white sea frozen in time, the air itself seemed to carry voices, faint and half-heard, drifting just below the threshold of understanding. It was a kind of heat that made the mind play tricks, that caused shadows to shift where no wind moved, that turned the distant tree line into something shimmering and uncertain. And it was in the suffocating, memory-soaked Georgia summer that something was discovered, something so profoundly wrong, so quietly horrifying, that it would shake the very foundations of Whitmore Plantation to its core. Imagine, if you will, a child, not a rumor of one, not a whisper or a half-remembered name scrawled in a ledger and then scratched out, but a living, breathing human being, small and fragile and impossibly real, found not wandering the fields, not hiding in a barn, not crouched beneath a wagon, but beneath the floorboards of the main house itself, beneath the very rooms where the Hargrove family dined and argued and slept and lived their lives, entirely unaware that in the dark, damp earth below their feet, a child had been surviving. For how long? No one could say with certainty. Days, perhaps. Weeks, more likely. Maybe longer. The thought alone was enough to make the stomach turn, to make even the most hardened overseer pause and look down at the floorboards beneath his boots with something approaching dread. What did she eat down there in the darkness? What did she drink? How did she endure the spiders, the rats, the serpents that moved silently through the Georgia clay? How did she breathe when the humidity pressed down like a living weight, when the air tasted of mold and ancient wood and the cold mineral bitterness of deep earth? And perhaps most disturbing of all, most impossible to answer, why had no one come looking for her? She had a name. She had a face. She had, somewhere in the tangled and brutal record-keeping of the plantation system, an existence that had been acknowledged, catalogued, and then, with a single stroke of ink, erased. Listed as dead. Gone. A loss to be noted and forgotten, like a broken plow or a flooded field. And yet, she was not gone. She was there. Right there, breathing in the dark beneath their feet. This is not a ghost story, though it carries the weight of one. This is not a tale of the supernatural, though it strains the boundaries of what we consider possible. This is a true and devastating account of a child named Ida, an enslaved girl of no more than 8 or 9 years, who vanished from the records of Whitmore Plantation in the spring of 1857 and was found alive beneath the foundations of Master's house 6 months later. What happened in those 6 months, how she survived, who knew, who helped, and who chose to look away, is a story so layered with cruelty and quiet heroism, with survival and complicity, that it demands to be told in full. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us where you are listening from. If this is your first time here, subscribe and hit the bell. We post new stories every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming. Now let us go back. Georgia. 1857. Whitmore Plantation sat on the eastern edge of Burke County, a vast and ambitious enterprise that had been carved out of the Georgia wilderness by Elias Hargrove the Elder some 40 years prior. By 1857, under the management of his son, Cornelius Hargrove, it had grown into one of the largest cotton-producing operations in the county, its fields stretching in every direction like the unfolded wings of something enormous and indifferent. The main house was an imposing structure, 2 full stories of whitewashed timber and red brick, fronted by a wide veranda supported by 4 thick columns that gave an air of permanence and authority. It was a kind of house built to signal power, to declare dominion over the land and everyone who worked it. Cornelius Hargrove himself was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with a square jaw and small, colorless eyes that seemed perpetually calculating something just behind whatever he was looking at. He had inherited not only his father's land, but his father's philosophy, which held that order was the highest virtue, and that any disruption of that order, however small, was a personal affront to be swiftly corrected. He was not known for outbursts of cruelty the way some planners were. He did not take pleasure in suffering, at least not visibly, but he had a coldness to him, a bureaucratic remove that in its own quiet way was just as devastating. He saw the enslaved people on his plantation, the way a farmer sees his tools, useful when functioning, a loss when broken, replaceable. His wife, Margaret Hargrove, was a woman of 43 who moved through the house with a kind of practiced invisibility, as though she had long ago made a private decision to see as little as possible of the world around her. She was gentle in her manner, deeply religious in her observances, and almost entirely disconnected from the reality of what sustained her comfortable existence. She tended her Bible and her herb garden with equal devotion, and she prayed each evening with genuine feeling for the souls of all mankind, a prayer that somehow managed to float above the specific circumstances of the hundreds of people living in bondage on a land outside her window. The person who truly ran the interior of the house was a woman named Clara. Clara was an enslaved woman in her mid-40s, her face a map of dignity and endurance, her eyes the color of dark river water, deep and moving and impossible to fully read. She had been at Whitmore Plantation since she was a girl herself, had watched 2 generations of the family grow up, had cooked their meals and cleaned their rooms and delivered their children into the world. She knew the house better than anyone alive, knew its sounds and silences, its hiding places and its secrets. And it was Cora who first heard the sound that would unravel everything. It began as nothing, a faint scratching, barely distinguishable from the ordinary nighttime chorus of an old house, the settling of beams, the scuttling of mice behind the plaster walls. Cora noticed it first on a Tuesday evening in early October, while she was banking the kitchen fire for the night. She stopped, tilted her head, listened. The scratching came again, soft and rhythmic, from somewhere beneath the floor near the far wall of the dining room. She stood very still for a long moment, her hand still resting on the iron poker, and then she went back to her work. But she did not forget it. Over the following days, the sound grew, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way a river rises after distant rain, slowly and with great patience, until what had once been barely audible became something undeniable. And then, one night, beneath the scratching, beneath the faint percussion of something small and persistent moving through the earth, Cora heard something else, a sound so unexpected, so incongruous with that dark and cramped space beneath the floorboards, that it stopped her breath entirely. It was humming, a child's voice, barely above a whisper, singing the fragments of melody she almost recognized, a song she had heard before, a song from the quarters. Cora did not go to Cornelia's Hargrove, not at first. In the world she lived in the intricate and treacherous landscape of the plantation, information was currency, and the spending of it required careful consideration. She had survived this long not by rushing toward powerful men with things they did not yet know, but by thinking, by measuring, by understanding what the consequences of each action might be before she took it. So instead of going to Master, she went to the only person she trusted without reservation. She went to Solomon. Solomon was an elderly man, somewhere between 65 and 70 years of age, though no one knew his precise birthday, because such things had never been recorded with any care. He had been born into bondage on a plantation in South Carolina, had been sold 3 times before arriving at Hargrove, and had accumulated in those decades of enforced wandering a quality that was rarer than gold in that world. He was trusted by the enslaved community, who brought in their disputes and their griefs and their impossible questions. Trusted grudgingly, even by Cornelius Hargrove, who employed him as a carpenter and who privately admitted that Solomon's work was as good as any craftsman he had ever hired. Solomon occupied that narrow, precarious strip of ground between the 2 worlds of the plantation, never truly belonging to either, useful to both, protected by neither. When Cora came to him that night, speaking low and fast in the thin shadows behind the tool shed, Solomon listened without interrupting. He had the gift of stillness, the ability to receive difficult information without his face giving anything away. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the middle distance, his large hands folded in his lap. Then he asked only one question. "How long has that sound been going on?" Cora thought about it. "Nearly 2 weeks," she said. Solomon nodded once, slowly, like a man who had just confirmed something he had been suspecting. Then he said, "I think I know whose voice that is." The name he spoke was Ida, and the speaking of it hit Cora like cold water thrown, without warning. Ida, she knew that name. Everyone in the quarters knew that name, though they had stopped saying it aloud months ago. The way you stop speaking the name of someone taken too suddenly, because the sound of it becomes its own particular kind of pain. Ida had been a girl of 8, the daughter of a woman named Ruth who worked in the fields. In the spring of that year, in April, Ruth had been accused of stealing a bolt of cloth in a supply house, an accusation she denied with fierceness that Cornelius Hargrove interpreted as insolence. Ruth had been sold south within the week, separated from her daughter, taken away on a gray Tuesday morning before the sun had fully risen, while Ida watched from the edge of the quarters, too small and too stunned to do anything but stand there. After Ruth was taken, Ida had come unmoored. She stopped eating properly. She stopped speaking much. She wandered the edges of the plantation in a way that made the overseers nervous, not because she was causing trouble, but because there was something in her stillness, in the blankness of her expression, that unsettled people. And then in June, she had disappeared entirely. The official account, entered into Hargrove's ledger in his own precise hand, was sparse and unfeeling. Ida, a girl, approximate 8 years, disappeared June 14th, presumed drowned in the creek or lost in the woods. Listed as dead, loss minimal. No search had been conducted beyond a cursory look through the nearby fields. No inquiry had been made of the other enslaved people, or if it had, no one had offered information that led anywhere. The matter had been closed within 48 hours, filed away in a ledger alongside the record of a broken axle and an unproductive acre of soil, and then forgotten entirely, except by the people in the quarters who had known her, except by Solomon, who had built a small wooden toy that Ida used to carry everywhere, a carved bird with movable wings, and except, perhaps, by whoever had known all along where she actually was. Because someone had known. That was the thing that Clara and Solomon sat with in the dark that night. The terrible implication coiled beneath everything else. For Ida to have survived beneath those floorboards for nearly 4 months, she could not have done it alone. She was 8 years old. The crawl space beneath the main house was a hostile and disorienting environment, dark in a way that had weight to it, alive with insects and reptiles and the constant damp, laced with the smells of rot and mineral earth. A child could not have found her way in and out repeatedly to find food and water without help. A child could not have known which boards were loose, which sections of the foundation had gaps large enough to pass through. Someone had shown her. Someone had been supplying her. And that someone, whoever they were, had been doing it right under Cornelius Hargrove's nose for months, with enough care and enough silence that not a single word of it had leaked. That required not just one person. That required a network of people, bound together by loyalty and terror and a fierce, shared love for a small girl who had already lost everything. Solomon told Clara to wait, to do nothing. Not yet. He needed to think, he said, about what came next, about how to approach this in a way that did not get anyone killed. Because that was the calculation they were always making, always had been making. Not what is right, but what is survivable. Not what should happen, but what can happen in a world structured to crush any act of ordinary human love. Cora went back to the house. She banked the fire again, though it did not need it. She stood in the kitchen in the dark, and she listened, and from beneath the floorboards, so faint it might have been imagination, she heard the humming again, and she recognized it now. It was a lullaby, the same one Ruth used to sing to Ida in the evenings, sitting outside their small quarters with the girl's head in her lap, a melody that had traveled from whatever distant place Ruth had come from, passed down through some chain of memory and grief, and now being sung by a child alone in the dark as a way of keeping the memory of her mother alive. Cora pressed her hand flat against the floorboards. She did not say anything. She just stood there, hand on the wood, feeling the solid resistance of the board between them, and she made herself a promise. She was not entirely sure yet what that promise meant in practical terms. She only knew that the shape of it was this. That child would not be forgotten again. Not while Cora was breathing. Not while Solomon was breathing. Whatever it cost them, whatever careful and dangerous thing needed to be done next, they would do it. The only question remaining was how. It was a Thursday morning in mid-October when the decision was made for them, not by Cora, not by Solomon, but by Ida herself, who apparently had grown tired of waiting or had heard something that frightened her, or had simply reached a point past which her small body could endure no more. Cornelius Hargrove was walking through the dining room at just past 7 in the morning, heading toward his study with a cup of coffee in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other, when the floorboards directly beneath his feet shifted with a sound that was distinctly, unmistakably alive. He stopped. He looked down. He heard it then, faint and close, a child's breathing, ragged and irregular, coming from directly beneath his feet. What happened in the next few minutes would be recounted differently by everyone who witnessed it. The details altered by the distortions of shock and self-interest and the strange mercy of selective memory. But the broad facts were these. Cornelius Hargrove called for help. 2 of the field hands were summoned to lift the access hatch near the back of the house, the small wooden panel set into the floor of the rear hallway that led down into the crawl space. And when they did, when the hatch was open and the wave of cool, mineral-smelling air rose up from the darkness below, what they found beneath was Ida. She was alive, barely. She was curled in a hollow she had scooped out of the earth between 2 of the foundation piers, a space no larger than a small wardrobe. She had lined it with rags, scraps of fabric, what appeared to be the stuffing from an old pillow. Beside her was a tin cup, empty now, and the remains of what had once been food. Cornbread wrapped in cloth, dried fruit, a piece of salt pork. Her hair was matted with clay. Her dress, what remained of it, was gray with dirt and barely recognizable as a garment. But she was breathing. Her eyes, when they opened and adjusted to the sudden flood of light, were still sharp, still present, still, against all reason, still containing something that looked very much like defiance. Cornelius Hargrove stood at the edge of the open hatch and stared down at the child he had listed as dead and done nothing to find. His expression, by all accounts, was difficult to read. Not guilt, precisely. He was not a man built for guilt in any straightforward sense. Something more complicated than that. Something closer to the discomfort of a man who has suddenly been confronted with the material consequences of his own indifference and does not know where to put the feeling. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, back to his study, back to his papers, leaving others to deal with the reality of what had just been uncovered. It was Cora who went down into the crawl space. No one asked her to. She simply went, lowering herself to the hatch without a word, disappearing into the darkness. And when she emerged, she had Ida in her arms, the girl's head resting against her shoulder, her eyes half closed. Cora carried her to the kitchen, the only room in the main house that Cora truly controlled, and she set her down on the bench by the fire and began the slow work of bringing her back to the world of warmth and light and food. Ida did not speak for 3 days. Not a word. She ate what Cora brought her, drank water and weak broth and eventually something more substantial, and she slept a great deal, long and heavy sleeps from which she sometimes woke crying softly and sometimes woke in complete and watchful silence. When she finally did speak, it was not to explain or to describe or to answer any of the questions that everyone, for their own various reasons, wanted answered. The first thing Ida said, in a voice roughened by months of disuse, was a question. She looked up at Cora and she asked, "Did you know I was there?" Cora looked at her for a long moment, and then she said yes. She had known, not from the beginning, but for long enough, and she had not told. Ida nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already believed, as though the knowing had been part of what kept her alive down there, the sense, even in the absolute darkness, that not everyone had forgotten her. The investigation, if it could be called that, was brief and unsatisfying. Deputy Aldous Fenn, the county's law enforcement, arrived 2 days after discovery, a heavy-set man with a permanently distracted air who seemed to regard the entire situation primarily as an inconvenience. He interviewed Cornelius Hargrove at length and Margaret Hargrove briefly. He walked once through the main house. He looked at the open hatch and the crawl space, and he wrote several things in a small notebook. He did not interview Cora in any meaningful way. He did not speak to Solomon at all. He noted in his official report that the child Ida had apparently concealed herself voluntarily and survived through, and here his language became notably vague, means yet to be fully determined. The case was listed as resolved. Closed. What was never officially established, what would never be put down in any document that survived a decade, was who had fed her, The network that Solomon had intuited, the careful and dangerous web of people who had brought food and water to that hatch over the course of months, who had shown a traumatized girl where to hide and how to move through the dark and how to stay quiet when the footsteps above grew close, those people were never identified. They had been too careful, too practiced in the necessary arts of secrecy that life under that system had forced them to develop. They said nothing and no one broke them. There is one account, written down in a personal journal by Reverend Caleb Marsh, an itinerant minister who visited Whitmore Plantation quarterly and whose unpublished papers were discovered in a church archive in Savannah more than a century later, that offers something approaching a final accounting. Marsh writes that he spoke privately with Solomon some weeks after the discovery, and that Solomon told him, without elaborating on specifics, that there had been 7 people involved in keeping Ida alive, 7 people who had each taken on a portion of the risk, who had each made the calculation that the life of a child was worth the danger, 7 people whose names Marsh noted with what reads like genuine anguish. He had promised not to record. What he did record was what Solomon said at the end of their conversation. They listed her as dead. Solomon told him. So we decided she would live anyway. That was the whole of it, as far as any of them were concerned. They said she was gone. So we made sure she was not. Ida survived. That much is certain. She appears in later records in Ohio. In the years after the war, a woman in her late 20s listed under a different surname, working as a seamstress, then later as a teacher of young children. Whether she ever spoke of Georgia, of the plantation, of the 6 months she spent in the dark beneath those floorboards, is not known. Some things are kept not because they are too small to matter, but because they are too large a hand to strangers. Some survivals are so complete, so hard-won, so woven from the courage of others and the stubbornness of the self, that they belong only to the person who lived them. But the question that lingers, the one that sits at the bottom of everything like sediment settling in dark water, is not about Ida. It is about us, about what we choose to hear and what we choose not to hear, about the sound that rise from beneath the floors of comfortable houses and are dismissed as the wind, as rats, as imagination, about what it means to list a life as lost before you have looked for it, about what it costs to keep someone alive in a world determined to erase them, and about the 7 people whose names we will never know who decided, quietly, in the dark, that the cost was worth it. Georgia, 1857, she was listed as dead, but something breathed beneath the house, and someone made sure it kept breathing.